Good day, ladies. We are going to finish chapter 13 today, and the title of the second part of chapter 13 is called Becoming, Remember Your Purpose. I clutched my chest and I sat up in bed frantically. It was still the dark hours of the night, but I was suddenly wide awake, anxious, burdened, angry. It wasn't a heart attack that woke me up. It was heartache so severe that it would continue to wake me each night for weeks to come during that difficult season. I remember that spring as though it was yesterday. I had never known such hurt and devastation in my adult life. The kind of pain that leaves you wondering how truth can be so elusive and circumstances can turn out so seemingly unfair despite all good intentions. Perhaps you know a similar season. Following Jesus does not spare us from sleepless nights, unjust circumstances, or silent cries into our pillows. Following Jesus promises comfort in the midst of those trials and hope that all wrongs will be made right in the end by God, and God can be trusted. I don't know about you guys, but I certainly can relate to that. There's been seasons in my life to where the deed was done, the heartache was there, and I think probably we just know that we should know that we are going to live through seasons like that in our life. And it's just having Christ with us as we go through those seasons that can make them bearable. Yesterday, we talked a lot about maybe a jealous or a bitter spirit because of someone else gaining something that maybe you thought you deserved. We talked about the prodigal son, and a little bit of a jealous and a bitter spirit had set into his heart, and his lack of contentment with what was left for him after his father had spent so much on the son that had done so little. And so there was a jealous, bitter spirit there that had come into his heart. We also talked about Eve, that let the enemy come in and convince her that there was more than the Lord had been giving her. And so a lot of times, we could fall into that trap. But today, this part of the chapter 13 is really focusing on betrayal and heartache and betrayal from someone that we're close to. And we know those can be the hardest. We're going to look at the story of David as we read through this. I'm going to keep reading and then I'll comment along the way. She has here, as I continue from scripture, she says, "He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore. For the former things have passed away. Behold, I am making all things new." And that is coming to us from Revelation 21, verses 4 and 5. But what about today? What about right now? In the middle of answers that don't make sense and outcomes that do seem unjust, how do we put off our bitterness in unjust circumstances and put our hope in God's sovereignty? We have an example in David as the Bible follows the course of his life. Anointed king, chosen by God, righteous character as a young man. Yet, David spent years hiding and running from Saul on account of the reigning king's jealousy and rage. I want to go back and reread that, because like the prodigal son, he had a promise and he had a thought on how his inheritance was supposed to be. David had a promise and a position that was supposed to be his, yet he's living in terror, running from people trying to kill him. We have an example in David in the Bible that follows the course of his life. He was anointed and chosen by God. So we're not talking about people that are living in sin. We are talking about people that have been chosen by God for different things. David here he had demonstrating righteous character as a young man, yet he spent years hiding and running from Saul on the account of Saul, who was the reigning king, had jealousy and rage towards David. David was promised the kingdom, and yet he waited years for the throne, and he also suffered the wrongs that needed to be made right. David was a man who knew how it felt to be attacked. David knew how it felt to be hunted. David knew how it felt to be betrayed, and also abandoned, and he was weary. All the while he was still seeking to obey the Lord. Now, Psalm 55 here, I researched this just a little bit. David was betrayed by more than just Saul, or being attacked by more than just Saul. His son Absalom, it was his third son, and it was David's favorite son. And Absalom went on rebellion and went against his dad. That would be one of the ultimate rebellions as a parent for your own child, to go on the offense or the defense, I guess you could say, against you. It's one thing to have a child disobey and go their own way, but this is literally his son Absalom leading an attack against David. Many think that this Psalm 55 that I'm about to read to you, a few passages from there, was David's anguish that he was going through when Absalom was leading this rebellion against his father. This comes from Psalm 55, 4 through 5, and also verses 12 and 14. Let me read you how David was feeling during this time in his life. It says, "My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fear and trembling come upon me, and horror overwhelms me. For it is not an enemy who taunts me. Then I could bear it. It is not an adversary who deals insolently with me. Then I could win and hide from him. But it is you, a man, my equal, my companion, and my familiar friend. We used to take sweet counsel together within God's house. We walked in the throng." Now remember, this is David writing how he felt, who was a man after God's own heart. David was no stranger to the unfair, no stranger to the unjust, and no stranger to the unexpectedly hurtful. He knew what it was to be betrayed by someone he trusted, to have the rug pulled out from under him, to be on the run when he was supposed to have a place at the table. Yet he hoped in the Lord in the midst of his very real circumstance by reminding himself who God was and why God was his comfort. During a trip to Israel, I crawled into the remote and hidden cave of Adullam. This is the cave where David sought refuge from Saul. I marveled, sitting in that very cave, that was a place where David wrote Psalm 57 as his heart turned from fear and desperation into assurance and praise. This is what David wrote in the cave as he was running and hiding. "Be merciful to me, God. Be merciful to me, for in you my soul takes refuge in the shadow of your wings. I will take refuge till the storms of destruction pass. I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me. He will send me from heaven and save me. He will put to shame him who tramples on me. God will send out his steadfast love and his faithfulness." Again, that was written in the cave as David was running from King Saul. And I thought of something as I was reading this to you guys. I didn't have it down in my notes that I wanted to share with you, but let me look here for just a second. It said that the rug had pulled out from under him, and he was on the run when he was supposed to have a place at the table. I wanted to pause on that for just a moment, because this was against a certain person. This was possibly against his son, they believe, when he was writing Psalm 55. So it was about a person in his life. But I think sometimes when we talk about, we thought we had a seat at the table. We thought that God had called us to do this. We thought that God had called us to do that. And many times in life, like the prodigal son, we may take up that spirit of betrayal and abandonment with even God, because we have called him our trusted friend, and we call him, we tell ourselves that he's closer than a brother. And then at times when we're going through these hard times, we let the enemy, just like the serpent yesterday with Eve, we let the enemy creep in and begin to tell us that God himself is betraying us. And so, yes, we can be betrayed by people, and that's reality, but we can get in our hearts from that enemy coming in and speaking and be convinced that possibly even God himself has betrayed us. And though, yet like I said yesterday, that's the difference when you let the enemy come in. He can just distort everything. Let me keep reading. Heartaches can either mold us into confident worshipers or defensive doubters. Who we become in the wrestling of them is not neutral. And what that's saying there is who we become as we walk through the process of heartache is not a neutral place. It makes a difference how we walk out this process. The shape that we take depends on where we find refuge in disappointment and the unexpected. David chose to direct his heart and mind to the faithfulness of God and his purpose, combating his disbelief by preaching truth to himself. He encouraged himself in the Lord. We talked about that in one of our other sessions. He encouraged himself in the Lord. It is as if he knew that there is more danger to turn our hearts away from God than to be on the run from an enemy. Let me read that again. It was if David knew that it was more dangerous to turn our hearts away from God than to be on the run from an enemy. Today, as we face the very circumstances that shouldn't be, this shouldn't have happened to us, we have to remember that we aren't promised answers that heal and outcomes we think we deserve. Our timing that makes the most sense to us, or the timing that makes most sense to us. Instead, what we are promised, that in every circumstance, God's purpose will prevail and will not be thwarted by manipulation, liars, or cheats. Maybe that both comforts and convicts you as it does me. Injustice and selfish schemes are no match for him who wastes nothing. God does not waste anything. And matter of fact, I have on a sweatshirt underneath this today. And on the back of it, my pastor, Pastor Kilpatrick, that I still call my pastor from years ago, he has a saying that he says, everything is Father filtered. And that's on the back of my sweatshirt. And even this that we're talking about today, betrayal, God maybe didn't make it happen. He didn't make that person cheat. He didn't make that person betray. He didn't do any of those things, but he will use those things. And we know that all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And that is from Romans 8:28. I want to leave you with a couple of things in the study guide today. I've gone over a little bit, so I'm not going to be long. But I'm going to quickly just read through this, and then I will post it. Read through Psalm 55 again, and ask yourself, have you ever experienced betrayal from a friend, a family, or maybe even a community? Maybe a business failed, and you felt like people in your community didn't support you. What words of anguish from the psalmist, from David, do you resonate with the most? What grips your heart as you read that is what it's asking you. What is David's response to what feels unjust and unfair? What about God is David determined to take refuge in? So that is from Psalm 55. And then, of course, I just want to remind you about Romans 8:28 that I closed the chapter with, and remind you that we know that all things, for those who love God, all things work together for the good, for those who are called according to his purpose. Remember, all these things that we go through, God can use each and every one of those. I'm going to close for today, and we will be back tomorrow to start chapter 14. Have a great day. Goodbye.